In this talk, I want to focus really on one question, and that is the question of what the crushing defeat that the United States has suffered in Afghanistan. And I think there's but no question that it is a crushing defeat. What it tells us about the limitations of American military power, and perhaps military power, especially when it's overwhelming anywhere in the world, that any power may, even in the future, exercise. One could also speak about the limits of American military intelligence. One could speak about the failure of the American Academy on Afghanistan. That is, of course, something that is really minuscule, because a number of people in the United States who really, in any sense of the term, are specialists on Afghanistan is really a very, very small number. I mean, I remember reading that in 2001, when the United States went to war, really with Afghanistan, launched an attack, and weeded out the Taliban, who had been in power since 1996. I remember reading at that time and writing about the fact that supposedly in the entire American establishment, that includes military intelligence, academic specialists, the State Department, there was only one person who knew Pashto. Of course, there are people who, of Afghan origin living in the United States. And those numbers are larger. Their numbers, of course, also increased in the first phase that was at the time of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then again after 2001. And then since then, there's been a stream of people coming. And of course, among Afghans, there are people who would know one of several languages that are spoken in the country, including Dari, which is Persian. But I'm talking here about the people who actually in the American establishment, right, who had the kind of knowledge that I mentioned. How many were there, right? So, and one of the reasons why there were so few is because Afghanistan fell through the cracks. What I mean by that is that the way that the American Academy is structured is, when you look at something like area studies, so we have South Asia, and within South Asia, the principal focus has always been on India. And then, of course, there are some people who work on Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka. No one really works on Bhutan and the Maldives. So that's South Asia. And then there are people who worked on the Middle East, right? On Syria, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, all of that. But Afghanistan was never included in that. Afghanistan would be included in what you might call Central Asian studies, but there are very, very few universities which have Central Asian studies even today, and certainly back in 2001, there was almost none. And this Central Asian studies programs became important, particularly after the breakup of the Soviet Union, when countries such as Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and so on emerged as independent nation states. This is really an aside, but it's an important one, because here I'm simply suggesting that there was a failure not simply of American military, there was also a failure of American military intelligence in some respects, and allied areas of inquiry, including people who are specialists, right, in that part of the world. However, my interest here really is, as I've said, what the defeat of the United States tells us about the limitations of American military power. Now, I think that there are several considerations that come to the fore in thinking about this. The first is the changing nature of war. Right? Some of you are aware of the fact that Barack Obama was, particularly among his critics, known as the drone president. He was known as a drone president because under Barack Obama, more drone strikes were carried out, and by a massive margin, than under any other American president. In fact, in the first year of his presidency, Barack Obama carried out more drone strikes, or the American military, strictly speaking, under his directions carried out more military strikes than in the entire Bush presidency. And Bush served for 2 terms, so that's 8 years. Right? I mean, that's an extraordinary fact. And so we have to understand the implications of that fact. And it is also reported very reliably that Obama personally vetted kill lists. That is, that when these drone attacks were being formulated, so he personally went over the list of targeted assassinations. Right? Of course, targeted assassinations are carried out not only through drone attacks, they can also be carried out by missiles. And they can also be carried out by special forces, including the Marines. Right? And it was, of course, a unit of these special forces that, in fact, carried out the assassination, if we want to call it that, of Osama bin Laden, right, in Pakistan in May 2011. Right? And it was, of course, a drone attack which led to the death of Qasem Soleimani, the person widely viewed as the second most powerful person in Iran, one of the major military commanders, of course, and the strategist, a military strategist who was killed by a drone attack by the orders of Trump on 3rd January 2020. Right? So drone attacks are one of the ways in which targeted assassinations take place. Now, I'm focusing here for a moment on drone attacks because what we need to understand is how the nature of warfare, particularly as carried out and executed by the American military, has changed. And see, there's something very paradoxical at work here, which is what I seek to explain. See, on the one hand, you could argue that the intent is to make war more humane. The Americans have insisted that these drone attacks minimize civilian casualties. In fact, at some point in Obama's administration, one of the most senior officials, I think it was his national security advisor, went so far as to go on television and say that our attacks are so precise that no civilians have been killed. This is, of course, not correct. The majority of drone attacks do result in civilian casualties as well, as is the case with the most recent drone attack initiated by Biden. And this is, of course, in the last few days after 13 American Marines or soldiers and something like 150 or 200 civilians, if I recall correctly, Afghan civilians were killed, right, at the explosion that took place in consequence of the suicide bombers detonating the bomb at the Kabul airport just a few days ago, right? So when we're looking at this, what we're saying is that, so, after this, there was a drone attack. And because the United States said that, they had intelligence which suggested that there was another imminent attack. And so they carried this attack, and then it turned out that nine civilians belonging really to one family had been killed. They had actually, I think, just come back home, and when that drone attack took place, their car was hit as well, and 9 people in that family were killed. Right? So civilian casualties do take place. But nonetheless, the whole rationale that has been offered by the Americans for these drone attacks is that this is actually the way to minimize collateral, quote, collateral damage. Collateral damage includes civilian lives. And so therefore the military is arguing that this is actually the best way to conduct a humane war. Would you rather have this, or would you rather have thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people killed, in trench warfare, in land battles, etc.? Of course, the other implication of this is that when you have drone attacks, it means that you can carry out attacks literally anywhere. Right? So therefore, the field of operations can be extended to any place. Right? So on the one hand, the argument is that war has now become more humane. Okay? On the other hand, it's very clear that, in fact, the field of operations becomes stretchable, almost infinitely stretchable, as if one may put it that way. Right? And so long as there are, quote, enemies, there will always be targeted assassinations, and therefore there will always be use for drone attacks. That is, that implicit in this worldview is also the idea that there is never going to be an end to war. Right? Now, one can use a kind of argument that Michel Foucault had advanced, the great French philosopher who's been extremely influential in humanistic inquiry and in some of the softer social sciences, right? And in philosophy, and a number of areas over the course of the last several decades. And what is that argument that he advanced? He said that basically we have, in a sense, become very good at learning to kill with kindness. I'm putting it in a very colloquial fashion. So there's a book he's got called Discipline and Punish. And it begins with this sort of gruesome account of a man who's being punished in France, maybe it was in Paris in the 18th century, and essentially, it's like you're having a juggernaut, a tank roll over this person. Right? Person's been convicted of some criminal offense. Now, this kind of horrific spectacle is not the way in which criminals are punished today. Well, you can do what the United States does, which is you can just lock away a huge number of people. The United States has the largest prison population in the world by a long margin, right? Well over 2 million people, right? You make them invisible, you see? Now you begin to understand what's really happening with these drone attacks, right? War is actually becoming invisible. Many of the people who are trained to fight in wars are basically people who are now really going into a computer room, and in the computer room, they watch over multiple screens, figure out where the targeted assassination is going to take place, and they press a button, so to speak. War becomes invisible. Now the real ethical question here is that in any way an advancement? And my suggestion is that I think we should be extremely wary of this view, that simply because we have minimized civilian casualties, that in itself does not provide the totality of the view that we need in order to understand whether conventions of war have in fact actually become humanized in some ways, whether we in some ways are showing that we are more civilized than our ancestors were. All right? Second aspect of the question is that no one can dispute the fact that the United States has been the preeminent military power, especially after World War II, although this was starting to become clear at the end of World War I. The United States entered World War I in 1917, as some of you might know. Right? So it was really involved in the war only for a very short period of time, and American soldiers never really went through the kind of trench warfare that was probably one of the most iconic images of World War I. You know, soldiers who were really dug into their trenches and fighting soldiers from another country. This happened in Flanders especially, right, in parts of France. So it happened in Holland, and that's what I mean by Flanders, Holland, Netherlands, Belgium, right? And then you had these trench lines, you know, in some other parts of France, in some other parts of Europe as well, including France. And it was, and of course there were tank battles, you know, enormous loss of lives, right? And death is before your eyes every second, so to speak. Right, so there we go back to that question of the fact that it's visible, and the whole endeavor today is to actually make death and the execution of another person by a soldier invisible, almost. Right? But what I was really talking about here was that the United States entered the war very late, and its preeminence as a militarist power became absolutely clear by the end of World War II. It was the sole nuclear power in the world, and it attempted to exercise its prerogatives as a preeminent power in many parts of the world. It is also a singular fact at the same time, which we should try to reconcile with the first fact that I've stated, namely the fact that it was a preeminent power, military power. And what is that second singular fact? That singular fact is that the United States has never really achieved what we could call a clear military victory in the course of the last 7 decades. The Korean War came to a stalemate. In Vietnam, it was doubtless dealt a defeat, although this is not necessarily how the American military wishes to see it. And there are also American politicians who have argued, along with some people in the military, that one reason why the Americans lost is because the demonstrations that took place in the United States against the war, the way in which they turned the opinion against the war, that this compelled the military to fight with one hand tied behind their back. Now, we won't really get into the intricacies of that, but what is certainly very clear is that the United States cannot by any stretch of the imagination be viewed as having won the war in Vietnam. It suffered a defeat, perhaps even a crushing defeat. All the more crushing in view of the fact that its opponent, as in the case of Afghanistan, was really a guerrilla army for the most part, in many ways. Well, yes, of course, you had the North Vietnamese, the army of the state, so to speak, and then you had the Viet Cong guerrillas, you know, right? But I think my point is well taken. And then, of course, if you see what's happened in Afghanistan, where after 20 years we have gone back to the status quo, right? That the very fundamentalist terrorist group, as the Taliban are known, that was defeated, are now back in power. So the question is whether this suggests that there are real limitations to military power. And these limitations are there not simply because in Afghanistan they had to fight people who had the advantage of knowing the terrain. Usually when you fight a war somewhere else, the opponent will have that advantage. The North Vietnamese had that advantage in Vietnam. If there the terrain was very different than the terrain in Afghanistan, nonetheless it could be argued that guerrilla forces could make their way, as if they have in Afghanistan, they've made their way through mountain passes into very rugged areas, which are areas that really have not been infiltrated by the state, which is something I'm going to talk about when I really discuss who the Taliban are and why is it that the Afghan forces capitulated, right? The armed forces of the Afghan state capitulated so quickly and so easily. So that's a separate talk, right? Where I'm going to discuss this whole question of the state and non-state actors. But what I'm suggesting here very simply is this, that when we look at Afghanistan, the argument could be made that it is the terrain that dealt a defeat too. The same argument could be made vis-a-vis Vietnam. But I don't think that the defeat of American military power can be laid only at the door of the terrain. Right? This defeat in Afghanistan has to be understood as a demonstration of the fact that today overwhelming military power is not necessarily an advantage. It may not be an advantage except in very, very limited circumstances. Whatever is being achieved with $700 billion, the budget of the American military, could conceivably be achieved with a fraction of that amount. Okay? But there are other implications. One of those other implications is that such overwhelming military power makes a state incapable of trying to address problems in other ways. The tendency is to always assume that you can resolve this problem that you have with another state, with non-state actors, with insurgents, that you can resolve this conflict through the exercise of military power. Such military power can also have very detrimental consequences that are domestic. One of the things that is not often discussed, although it's known to people who study policing in the United States, is that the military is known to change, okay, its gear, its ammunition, its rifles, its armored vehicles very quickly. Right? They have to be kept in, quote, tip-top shape. And of course, arms manufacturers are working around the clock to introduce new models. What happens to slightly older models? What happens to the supply that is in excess? It gets handed down to the police forces in American cities. And therefore, what we're really seeing in American policing is the militarization of American policing, with consequences, of course, that are extremely detrimental to the functioning of a democracy in the United States itself. So the limitations of this military power should be understood as extending to the US itself, in the sense that the repercussions are in fact actually such that they can erode the foundations of democracy itself. Now, this is a very brief set of comments here, because we would really, if we were looking at the other aspects of this, we would also have to look at the ways in which militarism has entered into the pores of American society. Right? We would really have to consider that in a very concerted fashion if we were doing a full-scale analysis of the set of issues involved here. So I will conclude now, because I simply wanted to suggest that I think that this is one of the most interesting issues that emerges out of what has happened in Afghanistan. And in my subsequent talks, coming up in the next couple of days, I will turn to the Taliban itself.